Good afternoon, and welcome to today's Regulatory Transparency Project webinar titled Does President Trump Have the Authority to Pause and Modify the Medicare Drug Price Negotiation Program? We're glad you're here. My name is Marie Blanchard, and I am the Assistant Director of the Federalist Society's Regulatory Transparency Project. Moderating today's discussion is John Shu. John's focus areas include constitutional law, securities and corporate law, antitrust laws, politics and international affairs. He served President George H.W. Bush and President George W. Bush, just as one example. As a note, as always, the opinions expressed are those of the experts. Thank you, John. I will hand it off to you so you can introduce our speakers for today.
Thank you, Marie, and thanks to the Federal Society and the Regulatory Transparency Project for putting this great panel together on this very, very important topic. Our panelists today, in alphabetical order, Mr. Jeff Steyer. Jeff is one of those folks who holds multiple hats. He's a senior fellow at the Consumer Choice Center and also a senior fellow at the Taxpayers Protection Alliance. So if you have tax problems, you can call Jeff. No, I'm joking. That's not what he does. He's also a policy advisor to the Heartland Institute. He's worked quite a bit on FDA and other drug issues, and also at OMB. And perhaps most cool, he was once a healthcare and environmental policy advisor to Mayor Giuliani in the great city of New York, which is Jeff's hometown. Our other panelist is Dan Troy, and we're very lucky to have him. Dan is currently the managing director at Berkeley Research Group, commonly known as BRG. Before that, he had several hats at Valo Pharmaceuticals in Boston. Prior to that, he was a senior vice president and general counsel at GlaxoSmithKline, and was very involved in managing their litigation, intellectual property, risk management, all the stuff that you would imagine a big shot general counsel handling. And before that, he was at Sidley Austin in the DC office, and was formerly chief counsel at the FDA, and also served as a liaison to the White House. And perhaps the most cool, Dan served as a law clerk to the Honorable Robert Herron Bork on the United States Court of Appeals for the DC Circuit. So thanks to Dan and Jeff for joining us. Today's topic is Medicare price negotiation. For those of you who are unfamiliar with it, the Medicare price negotiation program is part of the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act, which President Biden signed into law in 2022. The Inflation Reduction Act covered a lot of issues, and had a lot of money allocations for certain things. But the Medicare drug price negotiation program is unusual in that they're not Congress didn't allocate money to Medicare or CMS. Part of this requires that and allows Medicare to negotiate. And I am going to put that word in quotes, air quotes, because there's some question as to whether it's really a negotiation. And we'll talk about that when we talk about the litigations that are going on right now. But according to the statute and according to the Biden administration, CMS/Medicare is now allowed to negotiate pricing with the pharmaceuticals. And there are certain conditions for it. It has to be still under patent. There aren't other manufacturers of it, et cetera, et cetera. But to give you an idea of how much money that we're talking about, just for a single drug, for example, there's under the Biden administration, they issued a list of 10, first set of 10 drugs, which would be covered under the negotiation part of it. One of them is Eliquis. You've probably seen a lot of TV commercials about Eliquis. It's basically for the prevention and treatment of blood clots. Just to give you an idea, the total Medicare Part D coverage is $18.275 billion US dollars. That's a lot of money. Other drugs include, on that first list, include for diabetes, heart disease. These are all related to chronic diseases, and most of them related in some way to obesity. But we are talking about numbers in the many, many, many billions of dollars. And then even in the second set of drugs that was released recently, again, it's not as focused as the first set was, but it still has to do with a lot of chronic diseases and serious diseases. The pharmaceutical companies, not necessarily happy with this. There is a question, something called the pill penalty, where if a drug is administered through an IV, like where you have to go to a clinic or a doctor's office, and if it's administered, if it's considered what's known as a biologic drug, there you can still get reimbursed for that at the normal price. But if it's a pill, if it's something that's easy for the consumer to take, and I think even self-administered injectables falls under this as well. Um, now you have to fall under the quote mandatory negotiation unquote. Um, and we're talking about billions of dollars, and the pharmaceutical companies argue that this law and this policy will it's basically a government price control, and they argue that if they can't charge the normal market rate, um, that it'll take away from other drugs, it'll take away from research and development, and it'll take away from their innovations of drugs, because the money has to come from somewhere. Of course, on the other side, the Biden administration would have argued that that's just poppycock, and the pharmaceuticals are price gougers, and all they care about is profits. And we have our population in the United States, as in the rest of the world, is getting older, and so a lot of these diseases, asthma, prostate cancer, heart disease, diabetes, we're just going to see more and more of it, and therefore it's important for us to get a control on it. So with that, oh, I should say that we'll have a question and answer session at the end. But for now, let's have Dan Troy begin. And Dan, we'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, thanks. I'm going to actually explain why it's way worse than a price control, and that it is, very much a sham negotiation. And every time I use that word, there's going to be air quotes. So 3 disclosures first. Normally, I testify as an expert witness in FDA-related matters as not the managing director at Berkeley Research Group. And so I don't provide legal opinions because expert witnesses can't do that. But here I'm just going to provide legal opinions. Well, maybe there'll be some policy opinions, but they are entirely my own and not of my employer, Berkeley Research Group. Second, I filed an amicus brief on behalf of the challenging pharma companies in these cases, challenging the constitutionality of the IRA. No one paid me to do that. I did that entirely on my own motion, but I am, I guess, a participant as an amici. And my company and I do testify on behalf of pharma companies, including some that are challenging the law, but I have absolutely no financial stake or involvement in this matter. It's something that I've been just intensely interested in because I think it's a terrible law and terrible policy. So the part of the problem is, I think John alluded to this, price controls poll badly, but the word negotiation polls well. So they pretended that this was a negotiation, but it's not. Basically, CMS lists 10 drugs a year. So eventually almost all the drugs will be under this program. And you have to agree to participate as a pharma company and submit confidential information, or you face a fine of $1 million a day. And then you have to agree to this price, or your alternatives is to withdraw from all of Medicare, which accounts for about 60% of the market, or pay 19 times a tax, they called it a tax, so really a fine, on all revenues of the drug, including non-Medicare revenues, or you can just sell the drug and not be in the business of selling that drug. So importantly, there is I'm quoting now from a Novo Nordisk brief, there's no notice and comment rulemaking, there's no hearing on the selection of a judge of drugs, there's no hearing on the price CMS imposes, there's no neutral adjudicator to ensure that prices are fair and applied in a non-discriminatory fashion. There's no administrative review of CMS's unilateral decisions and no judicial review of them either. Okay. So essentially, CMS is the judge, jury, executioner, and beneficiary of this, which is why I think it is a constitutional monstrosity. It's being challenged under various flavors of takings and due process and excessive fines, unconstitutional conditions, even a First Amendment claim. Um, I think it's vulnerable on almost all of those grounds because it is such a it's so unprecedented because we've had price controls before. We have price controls, for example, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, but there's always a requirement that they be ultimately just and reasonable. Otherwise, they could be a taking. But that's not here. In fact, there's a ceiling price, but no floor price. And the reason why this is not a normal price control is I was the general counsel of GlaxoSmithKline. We sold products to European countries where there are price controls. A price control is you take it or you leave it. And there were times when GSK decided that it wasn't worthwhile for us to sell this drug to this company, to this country at this price. Okay. Here, you don't have that option. Here, the option is if you don't accept the price, if you don't participate, you're kicked out of Medicare, okay, which is, again, 60% of the market. So the question really is, are the courts going to look at the practical implications of not participating in this program, or are they going to, as they have and as the government is arguing, pretend that this is voluntary and that you have the choice not to participate in Medicare? So, turning to we can spend a lot of time on the constitutional arguments. I think there have been other webinars on that. This is really much more about, sort of what can the Trump administration do? And I think Jeff and I are going to be in violent agreement. There are things that CMS can do, especially it could not aggregate drugs together. Right now, what it's done is it said, well, even if an active ingredient of a particular product was approved, more than 7 years ago, we can take even later active ingredients that are different drugs according to the FDA and have different names and are entirely different indications, and we can put them all together, right? And then we can make the company basically sell all those drugs to us at one price. It's called a sort of single source issue. And CMS has been extremely aggressive about this. I think they grouped 5 or 6 of Novo Nordisk's drug all in one. And there's definitely administrative discretion for them to not do that. But the biggest problem in this law, which I think John alluded to, is what's called the pill penalty. And that is after 9 years, CMS can require a small molecule drug, a normal pill, to negotiate. And with respect to a biologic, that gets 13 years of exclusivity at protected and let's just say price freedom. That can really only be fixed by Congress. There are very sound policy arguments against this, pill penalty. Small molecule funding is down 70% since the IRA. Basically, the University of Chicago has an estimate that there'll be a $232 billion reduction in R&D for small molecule medicines over the next 20 years. And let's remember just sort of, let's get this back to patients. Small molecules are way better for patients. It's a dosage form that can be swallowed normally. They require fewer visits to a doctor and an infusion center. They can have significant therapeutic benefits because of their smaller size, simpler structure. They can get through the blood-brain barrier. Don't ask me to explain the medicine behind that. But because they can do that, that inhibits the delivery of other medicines for diseases with therapeutic targets inside the brain. And so we are really sort of shooting ourselves very much in the foot. And the problem with with presenting this to the American people is negotiation sounds great. Everybody thinks drug prices are too high, even though their actual out-of-pockets are very different than what the list price is. And it's the dog that didn't bark. People aren't going to know the drugs that aren't developed as a result of this. But according to a company called Vital Transformation, which did a lot of research on this, the revenue reductions on these drugs, the 100 drugs that will be potentially affected by this over the next 10 years, are so large that 37 drugs currently available today would likely not have come to market if the IRA policies had been in place over the past decades. And looking forward, Vital Transformation estimates that because of the IRA, as many as 139 therapies may not be developed and will not get to patients over the next 10 years. As I mentioned, we're already seeing companies stop critical research because of the IRA. And Avalier has a finding that only 0.3% to 0.1% of fee-for-service Medicare beneficiaries are likely to experience lower out-of-pocket costs for the first Part 10B drugs likely to be selected for price setting. And so what we're really doing is devastating the engine of innovation that has helped so many patients. The only people who I really think are going to be hurt on this are patients groups, and because they're really the only ones I think who are going to be able to be credible in talking about these medicines that are not going to come to market and not be developed because of this. And again, Vital Transformation, which I think did some work for bio, models a loss of U.S. jobs between a loss of 66,800 to 135,900 direct, and 342,000 to 676,000 jobs in the U.S. biopharma ecosystem. These are based on the 252,000 and the 365,000 are based on two impact scenarios. So we're hurting innovation, we're hurting patients, we're hurting our economy, we're hurting the biopharmaceutical sector. And we're doing it in a way that is really, really unprecedented. So I would hope that the folks at CMS will at least take a look at the last list of drugs that came out like 3 days before the election. So it's well within the time that the Trump administration can pull back on what was done. And I think I'll turn this over to Jeff, and I think Jeff will get into this more, but all of this was done by guidance, and what can be done by guidance can be undone by guidance. And so none of this has been done by notice and comment rulemaking. Arguably, the statute allows that. There are arguments that it didn't allow that, but that's the position that the government is taking. But as we've seen, what can be done by executive order can be undone by executive order. What can be done by guidance can be undone by guidance. It's a lot easier to change that than it is to change rules. And so one would hope, again, that the Trump CMS would not buy into this constitutional monstrosity. And if the courts get it right, then hopefully they will acquiesce in the judicial decisions invalidating it. But thus far, it has not been invalidated by any of the courts. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Jeff.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dan. Before we go to Jeff, I want to note that the statutory provision about the negotiation and renegotiation process is Title 42, Chapter 7, Section 1320F, as in Foxtrot. Speaking of negotiation and renegotiation, Dan, from your perspective, as GlaxoSmithKline is one of the most famous and prestigious pharmaceuticals, in your experience as a general counsel there, what would happen to GlaxoSmithKline if it wasn't allowed to sell to Medicare patients?
Oh, I mean, you could never not sell to Medicare patients. It would devastate the business. I mean, it's 60% basically of the U.S. business, and it's the U.S. business that drives the success of almost every, big pharma company. I mean, is it true that the U.S. subsidizes innovation for the rest of the world? Yeah, it is true. It's not fair, but, what are we going to, do about it? Start a trade war that we're going to lose at the WTO? I mean, I remember when I was chief counsel and I had this conversation with Mark McClellan, and he's like, if this went to the World Trade Organization, basically us and the Swiss would vote for us and everybody else would vote against us. And I'm not sure that, obviously our President Trump believes in aggressive sort of trade wars, but is he going to wage an aggressive trade war on behalf of U.S. pharmaceuticals. I'm not sure that that's, that high on his mattering map and on his mattering list, although it should be. I mean, in a just world, European companies, countries would not be free riding on U.S. innovation. So, that is a reality. But, if I have been in the room when the board and the senior executive team have had to decide how much money to spend on R&D. And if the returns are not there, then they will not make the investment. And it's not because they're evil or bad or only about profits. It's because the discipline is imposed by the market and by the shareholders who ultimately own the company. And the shareholders will say, if you cannot promise me, an appropriate risk-adjusted return on this drug, on these investments, don't make the investment. Either give me the money back through a dividend or give it to me through a share buyback. And that is one of the things that people don't realize. They think that pharma companies have unlimited ability to just print money. And that is just not the way it works. I mean, this is the only business in the world where basically you need to reinvent yourself every 9 or 13 years. Now, every 9 or 13 years, every whatever it is, 15 years, because all of your products go away and get genericized. And if there isn't an adequate, I mean, money will just go elsewhere if there's not an adequate return. These are not regulated utilities. These are companies that are taking enormous risks on drugs that cost $2.3 billion on average, according to Tufts, including the amortization of failures to develop.
All right. Thank you, Dan. Well, the new list of drugs includes Ozempic, Rybelsus, and Wegovy, or what are known as GLP agonists. And obviously that's to treat obesity and type 2 diabetes. But a lot of these come from the Scandinavian countries, so they might join America and the Swiss on that. But I can tell you that for those Real Housewives of Beverly Hills or Orange County that are over 65 and have Medicare, they're probably happy about this new list. Jeff, please take it away, and we're excited to hear your thoughts, especially from the consumer perspective.
Thanks, John, and thanks, Dan. And thanks to the Federalist Society and the Regulatory Transparency Project for hosting this debate. It sounds like some of us agree on some things, but I will disagree with Dan on one important factor. He said he's going to use scare quotes every time he refers to a sham negotiation. I would say, actually, that's a pretty accurate description, and the scare quotes only go if you don't preface it with sham. But I want to kind of reset a little bit and just give some additional context. I do agree with a lot of the substantive stuff that John used to introduce the discussion, and Dan, in terms of diving into the specifics of the Inflation Reduction Act. And I'll point people to my Twitter, where I just reposted an article that I wrote for Law 360 on this very topic. I am Jeff A. Stier, S-T-I-E-R, on Twitter. And you can find the piece. It's behind a paywall on Law 360, but there's a PDF on the Twitter. So resetting. The Inflation Reduction Act and the drug price negotiation is the law of the land. So I don't want anyone misinterpreting that we are recommending that the Trump administration ignore the law that Congress passed and that President Biden signed. So we'll acknowledge first that it's the law of the land. Another common misperception that I hear when we talk about repealing or replacing or pausing the implementation of the price negotiation aspect of the Inflation Reduction Act, or the IRA, is that you don't want lower drug prices. And everything that Dan said is absolutely true. I would call it killing the goose that lays the golden egg. And if you are concerned about high drug prices, think about, can we have a wizard waving a magic wand to lower the price of drugs? Let's call it the Wizard of Dr. Oz, right? Can that wizard wave a magic wand and say drug prices will be lower? That's what the law says. I think we all recognize that there are implications, there are unintended consequences of doing that. So I would say I think everybody recognizes that we would all benefit from the cost, from a lower cost of pharmaceuticals the question I think that ought to be on the table and that maybe Congress needs to reconsider and maybe society needs to have a conversation about is how do we achieve that without asking Dr. Oz to wave his magic wand and make the high prices go away? What contributes to the cost of drugs? You have to make sure that they're safe. Do we want to not make sure that they're safe? We have to make sure that they're effective. Do we want, there is a debate. Maybe the FDA should not require that drugs be effective before approving them. That's a more libertarian angle. So you have to kind of figure out what causes the high price of drugs. It takes a lot of research, as Dan pointed out, to almost $2.5 billion for every drug that comes to market. And as Dan explained, you need to be able to attract investors for a risky investment, and you have to give them a high rate of return for each individual investment to be able to put their money at risk. I think Dan did a really good job of explaining that. Dan kind of teased my interest, and someone involved in the Regulatory Transparency Project have long been concerned about what agencies tend to do is they tend to short circuit the process, and they don't always issue rules. They instead of going through the notice and comment period process as is required by law to institute a rule, a regulation, very often agencies kind of take a shortcut and do guidance. In fact, that's really a part of how the Biden administration's implementation has been done. And as Dan said, you can. It's much easier to repeal guidance by guidance than it is to repeal a rule, which would also require that notice and comment period and take a lot more time. And as my article on my Twitter, Jeff A. Steyer, will kind of outline for you, and Dan has a really good piece as well that was in the Wall Street Journal. Hopefully we can get that in the chat, and I'll tweet it out later if I get a link, is that there are a lot of constitutional problems. I'm not going to list them. Dan and John did a pretty good job of going through what they are. Going forward, right, the topic of this debate is, do we pause? What is the Trump administration supposed to do? Dr. Oz has not yet been confirmed, so maybe he'll be listening if he is confirmed. And no offense about the Wizard of Oz joke, but what are his options? What are the administration's options? Now, you've got a law that is coming under constitutional attack on many fronts, and many of those are legitimate. As I said from the beginning, the IRA and the negotiation is a rule of the land. So it's not as if the administration is going to ignore the law. However, while there are legitimate constitutional questions, many of them that have already begin to overcome some procedural hurdles in the court, particularly in the Fifth Circuit, it might be prudent for the Trump administration to say there are legitimate concerns about the constitutionality of this law. We are not saying it is not the law of the land, but we are going to pause our implementation of the law so that we don't cause further problems and let the courts figure it out. I do not believe that there is a requirement that the administration advance a law that it itself might recognize is unconstitutional. And because those lawsuits, many of them, are in process right now, and we're in the filing stages, I think it would be prudent for the Trump administration to pause implementation so that the courts can figure out whether the law that the administration is about to further implement, is constitutional in the first place. So I don't think, some consumer, anti-pharmaceutical consumer group will be able to challenge the administration's lack of implementation, and then for that litigation to leapfrog ahead of the ongoing litigation. So I think that's a very safe move for the administration to acknowledge, at the very least, acknowledge the constitutional challenges. Maybe the administration will recognize that it is unconstitutional and wait for the courts to figure out. But that doesn't exempt Congress, the new Congress, from paying careful attention. And as I think it was John who said early on, a lot of things were packed into the IRA. It happened very quickly. There is unfortunately no legal doctrine that says bait and switch, right? Clearly, lower drug prices are popular among the populace. Drug negotiations are equally popular because that may be one way to lead to lower drug prices. But imposing in this potentially unconstitutional way and punitive way without due process and with excessive fines, uh, there is no consensus. Maybe you've got, the far left might be okay with that, but they did not persuade the public of that, but they did pass it in the bill. And the Trump administration cannot say, well, the title of the bill was negotiation. John and Dan and Jeff just convinced the administration that this is not a negotiation, and therefore the bill was a sham. You can't say that. It is the law of the land. The question is how to move forward, and there are many fronts. So most minimally, they should pause it and allow the legal issues to wend their way through courts, because I don't think the Trump administration is looking for more accusations that they are forcing us into a constitutional crisis. And we've seen the news over the past few days. And I would like to see the Trump administration say, we don't want a constitutional crisis. We are not going to advance a law that has so many legitimate constitutional problems. But that leaves us to Congress. Congress ought to address drug pricing. It ought to try to find a consensus. I am in favor of negotiations. Negotiations are arm's length, even-handed. You have an opportunity to walk away without getting whacked with excessive fines. Maybe rewrite the bill. But the administration should not wait for this divided Congress on such a complex issue to rewrite the bill. It ought to pause, but Congress ought to stand up and fix the legislation, maybe give the American people what the previous Congress promised it would do, which is to negotiate drug prices. I at least am for that. And maybe one small way, I think there are going to be a lot of things you have to do to bring drug prices down, but I'm all in favor of negotiation. This is not negotiation, and therefore there are a number of tracks. Dan teased that I would get into the fact that it was guidance. The Trump administration today, even before Dr. Oz is confirmed, can undo that guidance, and I hope it does. So I'll finish there and hope to get into some questions. You're on mute. Yeah. John, I'm not hearing you. I don't know about everyone else.
There's a lot of litigations that are going on. AstraZeneca, Merck. I mean, all the big pharmaceuticals have filed lawsuits, either against the former HHS Secretary Javier Becerra or just HHS in general and CMS. So my question for both of you is let's talk about those litigations. It seems to me that there's some core arguments that's common to all the litigations. One of them is a takings argument. Another one is a procedural due process argument. The fines can range from anywhere between 185% all the way to 1900%, 19 times how much they make on a daily basis. And also, I think it's 19 times what the pharmaceutical company makes, not from Medicare, but overall, the overall income drug. From any particular drug. That's a lot of money. And so there's the procedural due process, and we get that from, of course, the BMW of North America versus Gore and the State Farm versus Campbell cases in terms of procedural due process. The takings, there was some argument for a First Amendment, but that's kind of gone by the wayside a little bit. And then AstraZeneca had an unusual argument about the Administrative Procedures Act, arguing that there was insufficient notice and comment. So let's start with Jeff. Would you please tell us your feelings on some of these arguments that are being made on behalf of the pharmaceuticals, because they haven't had any success at the district court level so far?
Yeah, well, it's still early on, and I could address what's happening in terms of the arguments by the pharmaceutical industry, but I think I'm with the Consumer Choice Center. I think there has to be a voice for consumers. I think patient groups should be very concerned about this. Who is their voice? And that's why we have the Constitution to protect not only the drug companies, but those that are affected by this. You mentioned there's 188%. I think I had 187.5% fine to start. They call it an excise tax, but it's a fine, and therefore, when it goes up to 1,900% of that drug's market value, then how is that not an excessive fine? There has also been a non-delegation argument, right? Congress, so the pharmaceutical industry is a major part of our economy, a major part of our healthcare, a critical part of it. And in one regime, as part of a larger Inflation Reduction Act piece of legislation, Congress handed off to an unelected bureaucrat the opportunity to set drug prices, not negotiate, but set drug prices, right? The law dictates a 25 to 60% discount for the negotiation, the so-called sham negotiation or the sham negotiation. And maybe if Congress had dictated what the drug prices should be, it's more of a legislative function. If you actually want to dictate drug prices, which I don't think you should, it may still be a taking. But under the non-delegation, you can't just say to the administrative branch, go ahead, here's 10 drugs every year and go and set the prices. It's a huge part of the economy. It's a huge part of our healthcare system. And non-delegation would indicate that Congress can't just hand that off to the administration to do, to the executive branch to do. So there's also that argument. But 187.5% fines to start. And by the way, which congressional staffer thought 187.5 would begin to address the problem? I'm curious about that. Maybe Doge can look into that. But it goes up to 1,900%. Clearly, they can call it an excise tax, but it is an excise tax that only comes into play if you choose not to participate in the negotiation program. And that's not an excise tax. That's a fine. And that fine at going up to 1,900%. Maybe, I don't know, maybe someone figured that, maybe someone in the Congressional Research Service said, you only reach excessive if the fine is 188%. And so we're going to keep it at 187.5 to start. But certainly it goes up to 1,900%, which makes it excessive. And I'm very concerned about the due process argument. I think because Congress knew that it was passing a sham negotiation, and in fact was putting in price controls, they inoculated themselves from any judiciary oversight, right? The legislation itself says that the courts can't review this. From a separation of powers perspective, yes, Congress passed the law. Yes, it is an obligation upon the administration to implement that law, and certainly it should be able to pause it as legal questions are addressed. But there is a role of the judiciary here. And in terms of not only was there a non-delegation problem, who is Congress to change the Constitution and say, no, the courts can't interpret this? It's simply unconstitutional.
All right. Dan, what are your thoughts on the
Yeah, so as I alluded
litigation?
to, I think what really exacerbates this, we've seen price controls before, is what Jeff just said, which is the fact that it's absolutely unreviewable. That's my understanding is unprecedented. Let me give you an extent. There's one very interesting case out of the DC Circuit in August of 2023. The opinion's written by an Obama judge. It's an Obama judge, a Carter judge, Edwards, and a Reagan judge, I think, maybe Bush, Henderson. And essentially, there was a mandatory deposit requirement found in the Copyright Act that said that if you get a copyright, within 3 months, you have to give 2 complete copies of the best edition to the Library of Congress. And if you don't, you're going to do that within 3 months, then you get liable for a fine. And if you willfully or repeatedly fail to comply, the fine is not $250, but $2,500. And these three DC Circuit judges found this to be a taking. So, not to get Latin a fortiori, or Calva Homer, but if that's a taking, boy, is this a taking. And the most important case is this case called Horn, where basically the government said, you're not allowed to market your raisins except at a particular price. And they are defended as saying, well, it's okay, because the benefit that we're giving you is that we're allowing you to market your raisins. And the court said, no. You can't condition, that's not a benefit. Now, of course, there are two arguments that the government is making here that actually the benefit that the companies are getting here is not just the right to sell their products, but the right to sell them to the government, and that there's no right to sell your product to the government. So that's where you get into this, is it really viable for a company not to participate in Medicare? Is it, as a practical matter, a gun to the head, just like, frankly, the Medicaid cut that was held unconstitutional in NFIB versus Sebelius, the Affordable Care Act case? The other argument that the government is running is, well, because we are not coming up to the factories and physically seizing these medicines, therefore it's not a taking. But, of course, we're not allowing you to sell it at what you might find to be a price. I mean, I think, John, you and I discussed this. To me, that's like if the government could say, you can't sell your house for more than a penny. But it's not a taking because we're not physically seizing your house. We're not. We're just saying you're not allowed to sell it for more than a penny. Now, obviously, that's kind of, a bit of an extreme hypothetical, but it's not dissimilar from what is going on here. The government is saying you can't sell your product except at this particular price, which, we're presuming is going to be less than would reimburse the companies for their, investment. And in fact, the statute explicitly says you're not allowed to consider the cost of the other drug failures. And that what this does is it gets to the whole, this is both a policy argument and a legal and a constitutional argument. It undercuts the entire business model of the pharmaceutical sector. The business model of the pharmaceutical sector is we try a lot of drugs, but it's a funnel, and like literally of the 5,000 compounds that we test, one makes it all the way through the process. And we need that one to basically cover the costs of the hundreds of millions that it just takes to study that one particular drug that makes it all the way through, but also the cost of the failures. Because otherwise, where's the cost of the failures covered, right? I mean, this sham negotiation really does get to the heart of the business model. And it's why it is inevitably going to lead, and already has led, to just less investment in particularly small molecules, which have this 9-year pill penalty.
And I want to add one thing to Dan's excellent, sometimes Talmudic discussion here. And that is, and I'm almost embarrassed to have to make this explanation, but I have heard on my Twitter that it's not a taking because the government isn't taking away the drug. But, taking, they say, only refers to property. Well, we're talking about intellectual property, right? We call it intellectual property because we recognize that intellectual property is property, and therefore it is subject to the takings provisions. You just can't take intellectual property, and you don't need to be a constitutional scholar to figure that out, because why would anyone be incentivized to produce life-saving intellectual property if it weren't protected as property?
Well, and on that, not just are patents recognized in the Constitution, as we all know, but patents, I think, have been protected by the takings clause since the late 1800s. I mean, it's not a new thing to say that patents are protected intellectual property from a taking.
All right. Well, we've already got a flood of questions from the audience. Thank you very much. We hope to get more if we can. Please use the Q&A feature on your Zoom app or program. One thing, let's start with the presidential power question. Now that Pam Bondi has been confirmed, we know that the Trump administration has the power to pause any litigation, whether it's this or any other subject, to review and to consider it. So we know that. Dan and Jeff both mentioned Congress pushing through some amendments or revisions to the drug price negotiation program. But Dan, do you believe that the administration has the power to pause the program, not the litigation, but to actually just pause the program pending, let's say, another amendment through Congress or pending review of the litigation? Because there is a bill right now, a bipartisan bill, looking to remove the pill penalty from the program.
Well, so it's not for me to give advice to the pharmaceutical sector, and I'm not a lobbyist, never have been, not a Hill person. But in addition to pursuing the litigation, I would be putting a lot of my sort of efforts into trying to get that pill penalty revoked, because that would make a very big difference as a practical matter, and especially if there's a bipartisan consensus, as there should be, to get rid of this pill penalty. I don't know who thought of why you would do this to small molecules as opposed to biologics. I mean, talk about unintended consequences. I think you alluded to that earlier. I think that the president could pause this program and could not pursue it. I mean, I don't know that that's something that they're going to do. I would hope that they at least again would look at the list of drugs that came out 3 days before the election, and particularly would modify this, I think, very problematic approach of saying, so to be clear, the way FDA approvals work is you get an active ingredient approved for a particular indication. That is its own new drug application, NDA. That is a drug, okay? Many years later, if you get the same, or a variation on that active ingredient approved for a totally different purpose, that's a different NDA. It's not a supplemental new drug application. You can sometimes do a supplemental that it adds that adds an additional indication. But if you've got this for an entirely different condition and an entirely new, form or dosage or whatever, that's it. That can be its own NDA. And what CMS has done is said, well, if it's the same active ingredient, if these drugs are basically related, we're going to go back to the earliest one and we're going to pull them all together. And that's how they're getting to Wegovy, for example. And I definitely think the Trump administration, could pull back on that interpretation and on that approach. I think if presidents are allowed to decide whether or not they think that a program is constitutional and unconstitutional. If they genuinely think that it's unconstitutional, they could say, we're going to, I suppose they could acquiesce in the court challenge. That has happened, the sort of sue and settle, approach that certainly has been pursued in Democratic administrations. So they could acquiesce in the court decision, or they could just say, we're going to pause it until, the courts sort it out. I don't know if they can really pause the litigation other than by giving up. I don't know. You'd have to go to the court and say, we want to stay this. I don't know. I don't know that they can do that unilaterally. But I don't think that a president is forced to affirmatively, do a program that the president believes in good faith is unconstitutional.
All right.
So
thanks for that, Jeff. If you were a litigant, if you were a pharmaceutical company litigant, are there any other arguments that you would make besides the takings and procedural due process arguments and the other arguments that we've discussed already? What's missing, if anything?
I think those are the key arguments. There's certainly and we've discussed it until now, there is the economic argument, there is the policy argument. I would like to highlight on behalf of consumers that if you do this, if you continue on with this program, if Congress doesn't fix it, if we do not prevail in the courts in overturning it as unconstitutional on any of these grounds, what are the costs to the next generation? right? So those are
I'm,
going
so,
to
I'm sorry, Jeff. The next generation of drugs or the next generation of humans?
Yes.
both the next generation. And
Yes.
essentially, what we're doing here is we're taking money and saving money for current consumers at the expense of their children and grandchildren who will no longer benefit from new life-saving innovation because we will have killed the goose that's laying the golden egg that continues to innovate because there won't be investors who think it's in their worthwhile to take on a risky investment while having those profits capped so low artificially. Again, that goes to waving the magic wand. You can't wave a magic wand and lower drug prices just because you want to without suffering consequences somewhere else, squeezing the balloon. Something else is going to give. And what's going to give is the pipeline of innovation, of research and development that funds the innovation that will lead to new life-saving drugs for your children and your grandchildren and beyond. So I think that's something that people need to consider. That's why I began with you need to have consensus. Okay, we all agree we want lower drug prices. The real question is how do we achieve lower drug prices? What is it that we have to give? Life is full of compromises. There's pros and cons to everything. And the issue is, what do we want to compromise? And I don't think the American people want to compromise innovation for their children and grandchildren to save themselves money right now. That doesn't mean I don't want lower drug prices. I do, but we have to address the underlying reasons those drug prices are so high. And do you want to give up some safety? Do you want to give up some efficacy? Do you want to crack down on trial lawyers? What do you want to do to bring the cost of drugs down without breaking the system that brought us those drugs in the first place?
Yeah, I just want to
Dan?
add, it's
Oh,
just
go ahead, Dan.
impossible. It's just impossible to believe, right? If you believe in any kind of economics, that you can pay less for something and get the same amount or more. I mean, it just defies common sense. Now, you know, um, a lot of the problem is these are, drugs that will never be approved, and so nobody will know that they're not getting this medicine. But when I was at FDA, we found something super interesting. Um, if you ask somebody who's not sick, who's not a patient, what's their risk tolerance? Their risk tolerance was like, I don't know, 1 in 100,000, 1 in a million. It was like really, really high, right? I don't want to ever have a safety problem. You ask people who are sick, you ask patients, what's their risk tolerance? What are they willing to accept in terms, for the benefit? What kind of safety risk are they? And it was entirely different. Okay. Many of the American people are not patients, but we will all be patients. We will all at one point,
Yeah.
if we live long enough, have to take medicines and have health issues.
Yep.
And, all of us want, innovative new drugs to address the many, many, many disease conditions that we don't yet have therapies for. People don't realize this, but you go up to someone in the street and you're like, how many new drugs are there a year? And people have no idea that the average number of new drugs in a year are between 30 and, let's say, at the max, I think one year maybe they hit 50, maybe. And a lot of those are orphan drugs. Of course, we haven't even gotten into is the disincentives in the IRA for orphan drugs and the disincentives for doing research to get additional indications. Those are two other massively problematic policy, problems with this with this law. But again, we're not going to really. I mean, obviously, the pharmaceutical sector is trying to raise people's consciousness about the dog that doesn't bark and the dog that won't bark and the drugs we won't have. But that's different than taking something away that people have.
Yeah.
And so that's part of the problem with making these arguments.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I want to flesh out what Dan said, highlight the importance of studying indications other than the initial one. A lot of Wegovy and GLP-1 information in the news. But every day, it seems, there is another article that comes out, published journal article, that seems to suggest that Wegovy, which affects reward centers in the brain, I think today's article was alcoholism. I'm interested in tobacco policy. Individuals, there maybe haven't been enough studies on this, but individuals who are on Wegovy have reported less of a desire to smoke. I've heard the same thing about excessive shopping, anything that affects the reward centers, because of its effect on weight loss. It has been indicated for heart disease, but now it may be indicated for sleep apnea, a major cause of stroke. There is value for consumers to have this additional research on indications, because if it's not indicated for a certain disease or effect, the insurance companies won't pay for it. So if you want your insurance company to pay for your new innovative drug, you want those pharmaceutical companies to do the research to justify new indications that will, number one, address your underlying condition, but it'll also help get it covered by insurance. So there
Okay, oh, sorry, Jeff, we're bumping up against the time. I want to ask Dan one last question and Jeff one last question, but I'm going to have to limit your answer to about 30 to 45 seconds each. My apologies. Dan, would it make any difference if you negotiate the price of a drug at the drug launch as opposed to now after it's already nearing its loss of exclusivity?
Well, first of all, it's not nearing its loss of exclusivity. That's the problem, particularly with the 9 years.
Okay.
But let's be clear. Pharmaceutical companies have to negotiate the price of their drugs with PBMs, with insurers. This idea that they're free to set any price at all that they want is just not right. BRG has a study out that says 50% of the drug dollar goes to manufacturers. The other 50% goes to PBMs, to insurers, to pharmacies, to all sorts of other people. This idea that, drug companies can do whatever they want, it's just wrong.
And then Jeff, final question. Do you think if the pill penalty were removed such that biologics and small molecules were treated the same way, do you
13
think,
years.
right, and the distance, do you think that would help to alleviate the problem that we're facing with this? Is that enough?
No, it's not enough. Would it help? You're asking two different questions. Would it help? Of course it would help. It's takes something really bad and makes it only pretty bad. But no, it wouldn't solve the problem, because the underlying problem is what we spent the last hour discussing. Certainly, that would help, but it wouldn't resolve the problem. It wouldn't relieve Congress of the obligation to fix the law, and it won't relieve the courts from their obligation to address the constitutional issues. And it doesn't give, if that happened, it wouldn't give the Trump administration a reason to say, okay, well, there's no problem here. There is. And, pausing the implementation would not pause the litigation. You'd be pausing the implementation to let the litigation play out, because you don't want to implement a law that may very well be unconstitutional.
All right. Well, Dan Troy, Jeff Steyer, thank you very much for sharing your expertise. It was a great discussion, and I hope everybody enjoyed it. Thanks for joining us. Please join us again for our next RTP, Regulatory Transparency Project webinar, and I'll turn it back to Marie Blanchard.
Thank you, John. Thank you for moderating. And thank you, Dan and Jeff. We're glad also to the audience who came and listened to this discussion. And if you would like to find similar discussions like this, you can go to our website, regproject.org. We'll see you next time.
Thanks so much, everybody. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.